We are live.
Okay.
We
Ah.
are live. What is going on today, Justin?
Ah. We're here. We're back. Ah. Ah.
We are back, chapter 37. I love it. You are totally decked out today. Purple, everything. Love it.
You know, purple's my jam.
I know. It's a good color. Justin, do you want to start us off with reading verse 1 of chapter 37?
Let's do it. Okay. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had lived as a stranger in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers, while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a multicolored tunic. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms.
Verse 1, as I mentioned before, really starts off kind of ending Jacob's time as the central character of this historical narrative. And so that's really what verse 1 is all about. Moving on to verses 2 through 4, we ultimately find out that Joseph's a very young man, 17. Some of y'all are 17, and when you're 17, I thought that I was very, very, very smart. um,
Turns out you're not as smart as you think you are when you're 17.
that's true. That's true. And I would argue
Very
that
true.
20 years from now, you and me will think that we weren't nearly as smart as we thought we were now. You know what I mean? So I think this
Yeah, but
could.
I still think that I will feel like I'm less dumb now than I was at 17.
That's true. You and me might have been particularly dumb though. Okay.
I was particularly dumb at 17.
I would put myself into that category as well. But I would just say that you can be very smart at 17, much smarter than you and me. Needless to say, you know, at 17, you are still learning about the best ways to communicate. And so I would just keep that in mind, right? Joseph's a very, very young man, you know, coming into adulthood, but still has a little bit to learn here. And so he's not going to get everything right, you know. I mean, no matter how old you are, you're not going to get everything right. So, and we see that he was ultimately out with his brothers. Now, these brothers, and pasturing a flock, okay, which is basically just moving the flock along to have them graze and eat food. Joseph ultimately brings a bad report to their father about his brothers. Now, should this bad report really be that much of a surprise? I would argue no. I mean, Jacob's, I'm sorry, no, Joseph's brothers were actually into some pretty scammy stuff in previous chapters. And we could say scammy. I mean, they ultimately used deception just like their father Jacob to ultimately convince the entire people of Shechem to get circumcised, and then ultimately came in and killed every last man of the town. And
Scammy.
and you could argue that they did that potentially to get their sister back, um, Dinah, I believe it was,
Yep, homegirl.
and so you could argue maybe maybe they were justifying that. It's really hard to say. However, um, they ultimately killed every single man there, and um, their father was not happy about that. Not happy about that one single bit. So and then they stole all their stuff. You know what I mean? So these guys weren't exactly could have been into bad stuff. You know, they could have been
Yeah.
into
They
bad
weren't
stuff.
they weren't walking old ladies across they weren't helping old ladies across the street. They're not those kind of dudes, right?
That's right. That's right. That's not what it seems to us so far. And so the fact that they were up to no good and they were partially raised right in this land of Shechem, which was also up to no good, you know, in part. So I mean, there's you know these guys. The fact that Joseph brought a bad report um, seems to be an indication and an implication that these guys were, you know, participating in some wicked behavior, so not good things, um, which is good to know. Justin,
Yes, so as Henry said, we've switched, and the main character now is Joseph, and actually, this is going to be there's going to be a focus on Joseph to go ahead and close out the book of Genesis. So we're kind of in our last stretch as far as the protagonists that we're going to be focused on. So the author is clear here that the descendants of Abraham have not taken possession of the land they got it promised yet, because he talked about Moses addressed them as strangers in the land. So we see, as Henry was talking about with the bad report, Joseph was obedient in that he brought back an accurate account to his father of what was going on. But then Jacob's favoritism caused problems in the family. So we see that Joseph was being favored by their father.
and in
Um,
part, right? I mean, Joseph was the son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel.
right.
And so this is really of no surprise that Joseph ends up getting favored in this circumstance. Also, in previous chapters, we learned that Jacob ends up ordering his family in a very clear rank of who
Mhm.
was most important and who was least important whenever he was coming back to visit his brother Esau, who he feared might kill him and potentially his entire family. And so the fact that Joseph was favored is not a huge surprise either.
Yes, and so he ended up giving Joseph elaborate gifts, like a multicolored tunic, which could refer to or could be significant that Joseph would receive more inheritance, or that he would be a future leader of the family. Those could have been signs for that back in that time. But either way, Joseph's favoritism, with being the favorite of their father, along with Joseph telling on his brothers, we see that his brothers hate him as we kind of start this chapter.
Right. So this attribute of favoritism that passed down from Jacob's father, Isaac, Isaac also practiced favoritism. Isaac preferred Esau and favored Esau. Rebecca favored Jacob. And so, anyways, this is important, in my opinion, because you notice the attributes and characteristics of one person can potentially pass on through the generations, and it creates all types of problems. And we're going to see how that favoritism really plays out here. So be very careful. Your actions today can have an impact on many generations in the future. Then Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Please listen to this dream which I have had. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf stood up and also remained standing. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf." Then his brothers said to him, "Are you actually going to reign over us? Or are you really going to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he had yet another dream, and informed his brothers of it, and said, "Behold, I have had yet another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He also told it to his father as well as to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Am I and your mother and your brothers actually going to come to bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind.
So, in addressing verses 5 through 8, um, we just see in general, as in the rest of this book, starting with verses 5 through 8, the dreams were a big part of Joseph's life and how God communicated with him prophetically. And we're going to continue to see how that was significant as we read the following chapters. So God also communicated with Abraham, Jacob, and others through dreams in the book of Genesis. So this dream used an agricultural illustration, and I'm going to talk more about that when I discuss the following verse as well. So Joseph, being a younger brother, culturally would not rule over his brothers, but we see that God disrupts the cultural norms, as we saw with Jacob and Esau, as we're going to find out in future chapters. And so this event only served to make his brothers even more angry with Joseph. So this is where we want to get some interaction and get some opinions of some of our viewers. I personally see Joseph as the most righteous man in the book of Genesis, one of the most righteous. He's definitely a character that it's hard to find fault in him, except in this one area. And Joseph is one of Henry's favorite men in the Bible. And so me and Henry have argued about this for years. But here's what I'm thinking. Joseph was super righteous. I admire him. Hey, top guy in Genesis. But here, I think that Joseph was potentially being a spoiled brat. Here's the thing. Joseph knew that he was receiving favoritism, and that wasn't his fault. Joseph knew the circumstances, and I think it lacks definitely maturity. As Joseph, the way that, as we read on, the way that Joseph handled situations, I would hope to handle situations half as good in the rest of my life as Joseph handled situations. But in this situation right here, I think we see a real lack of maturity and discernment, and maybe potentially a spoiled brat. So that's my side of the story. Henry has a different side, and whoever you agree with, put in the comments below. Go, Henry, go.
I actually already addressed this heavily. If y'all didn't hear earlier, I heavily emphasized how young Joseph was. And is that an excuse for all of Joseph's actions? Absolutely not. Joseph, I'm sure, could have handled the situation better. I think it's clear that Joseph thought that his dreams were clearly important, and thus he wanted to share them. But the way he goes about it sounds like he could have done it in a better way. Um, Whether he was supposed to share them or not, maybe he ultimately keeps that to himself. But regardless, he was excited about these dreams because he clearly thought they were important. And so I would agree he definitely was unwise in his approach. The fact you're 17 doesn't mean you have to be unwise, but if Joseph was a 30-year-old man at this point and still doing stuff like this, I would seriously, seriously question his street smarts, his wisdom, for doing something like this. Yeah, it's tough. Definitely Joseph, he's being favored. He has a special tunic, and he's also ratting out his brothers, I mean, sending out bad reports. I mean, you're not going to make any friends with that combination. Justin, you were kind of digging into that. Did you want to discuss more about the dreams?
Yes. So now moving on to verses 9 through 11. In ancient culture, astronomical symbols could represent rulers. So, as Joseph mentioned here, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And so the 11 stars represented his 11 brothers who would bow down to him in the future. And so God was confirming with the second dream that this was prophetic, and it was still an illustration using the astronomical symbols, which communicated the same idea that he was going to be a ruler. However, like the other dream that God gave Joseph earlier, this wasn't a clear communication, right? It was God used illustration to communicate the message, not his voice to tell Joseph something directly. So Joseph understood the interpretation of the dreams. And so this actually ends up being very significant language because it is used again in Revelation chapter 12. And so if you take a futuristic approach to how you interpret the book of Revelation, you use this in looking at and interpreting what the focus is in certain areas. And so we see in Revelation chapter 12 that the focus is Israel. And let me just read that real quick. So Revelation chapter 12, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. So this is the woman here that's talked about is the nation of Israel with the 12 tribes. And John the apostle borrowed this language from the book of Genesis to communicate what was going on, to communicate and talk about Israel, the nation of Israel. So as we see in the closing out verse of this section, that even though his father Jacob rebuked him for telling this dream, the text says that Jacob still thought about what Joseph said.
Absolutely. And just to kind of repeat a couple things. One, it's my understanding that these sheaves was a specifically why sheaves? Why not anything else? You know, why were it sheaves? Why were in the first stream all the individuals were represented as sheaves or something else? This apparently was prophetic to the fact that his brothers would in the future come to Joseph for food. And then, as Justin mentions, this moons and stars analogy was more of a much greater prophecy, and not only would his brothers come to him for food, but he would actually rule a nation. And so, yeah. Anyways, let's move on to verse 12, unless you have something else.
Nope, I'm good. Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are your brothers not pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said to him, I will go. Then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, what are you looking for? He said, I am looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. The man said, they have moved from here, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan.
Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. Basically, Jacob asks his favorite son, Joseph, to go check up on his brothers again. And ultimately, we know that the brothers already hate Joseph, and he has a history of telling on his brothers when his brothers are up to no good. And so the reality is, Jacob doesn't do Joseph any favors here. You know what I mean? Sending him as like it's kind of like this manager, right? It's kind of a manager that comes back and gives a report to, and so it's almost like Joseph is in, you know, I don't want to say in charge, but has an influence ultimately on what his brothers' favor is going to be with their father, Jacob. Jacob's trusting Joseph to, you know, give a report on their brothers. That's a manager's job. You know what I mean? That's That's the job of a trust, someone you trust, and ultimately they know that Joseph has the power to determine their fate. I do think it's interesting that um, Jacob ultimately goes to check up on them, and they're not in the location that their father thought that they would be in. Now, obviously, when you're pasturing blocks, aka ranching, it's possible that they had a good reason to be in a different spot. It's also possible they didn't have a good reason, right? And they were doing something they shouldn't be doing, which they have a history of doing already, right? Doing bad stuff. So that's important because whenever Joseph rolls up on his brothers, if they're not in the spot where they're supposed to be, maybe that they're
It's going in the report.
it's going in the report.
Yeah, so as we see, Joseph was obedient to his father and going to check on his brothers, and he ended up having to travel around 65 miles to meet up with to check on his brothers and see where they were and how they were pasturing the flock.
Absolutely. It's a long way to travel. And Dothan, from what I read, was actually um, maybe even 15 miles north of that.
Right, so it would have been 50 miles from where he was to Shechem, and then 15 miles on top of that. So that was
50?
the
Another 50?
15. No, 15.
One five, yeah.
That's why I said 65 miles, because
Oh, okay.
from where he was to Shechem was 50, and then Dothan was 15 miles more. So
Yeah. All right, verse 18. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came closer to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, 'A vicious animal devoured him.' Then we will see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands by saying, "Let's not take his life." Then Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, so that later he might rescue him out of their hands, to return him to his father." So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the multicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it.
so Joseph's half brothers now, as we see in these verses, plotted to kill him. So Reuben convinced the other brothers not to kill Joseph, but instead to just throw him in a pit. And Reuben had the plan to come back and rescue Joseph later. And one of the lessons we see here is it's best to get control over our thoughts and emotions and deal with them early instead of letting them continue on to becoming actions. I would like to read in Exodus chapter 20. So the last of the 10 commandments: you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male slave, or his female slave, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So the idea of coveting is this idea inside in your mind, your heart. You can't. Uh, you could covet privately, and no one would know it. But the idea here, as we also see on the Sermon on the Mount and just the things that Jesus said, is that sin starts in the heart and then leads to actions. And so we saw how that happened with Joseph's half brothers. And so in our lives, when we are feeling jealous or envious or angry or whatever about something, we should deal with it in a biblical way and address it while it's a heart issue before it becomes a behavioral issue.
Yeah, his brothers were jealous of Joseph, for a number of reasons. And I completely agree. I mean, obviously, he's rolling around with a special tunic. He's his dad's favorite kid, basically, and he gets special treatment. He's basically is acting and has similar roles as a manager over them. and now he's having these special dreams in which he says that he's going to rule over them. I mean, there's a lot there. Obviously, they just don't like him because of that. Maybe, like Justin said, he's spoiled. He's being kind of a brat, kind of braggadocious, in his actions. I mean, he's taking this tunic out out in front of his brothers all the time. Guess what? His brothers didn't, according to the chapter here, I don't hear about his brothers getting any special tunics. You know what I mean? So this is just a symbol of the favoritism that he has within the family. And so to piggyback along with what Justin said, whenever there's a fellow Christian or fellow anybody that's seeing success, I think we should be happy for them, not show covetousness. God gives all of us different blessings, and we should cheer them on, not to be ultimately a hater. As soon as you're jealous or whatever, that's not the right emotion to be had. Why wouldn't you want your friends to succeed? Why wouldn't you want people to succeed? Anyways, Reuben is the oldest son here. And if you recall from chapter 35, Reuben actually slept with his father's wife, Bilhah.
Whoa, Rubes.
Yeah, that's in chapter 35, verse 22.
But he's the good guy in this section.
And Israel ultimately find out about it. Yeah, so there's some question. It's like maybe Reuben was trying to get back on his father's good side, you know what I mean, for ultimately saving his brother, or maybe Reuben had noble intentions. It's hard to say
Rubes.
exactly. But Reuben messed up a little bit in the past, and one way to get back in your father's good graces would absolutely be to save his favorite son from these bloodthirsty brothers of his. So that's something ultimately to be noted. Here's the other big thing on this one. Specifically in verse 19, they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." And then it goes on later in verse 20, the second half of verse 20. Then we will see what will become of his dreams if they kill him, essentially. And so, listen, Joseph's dreams cannot be prophetic if he's dead, right? You're not going to be the in charge of anybody if you're buried 6 feet under the ground. So at this point, if these dreams were prophetic and his brothers were concerned that they were potentially true, then not only are his brothers looking to take Joseph out and and keep this from, but they're also really fighting against God's will. You know what I mean? Which is also totally not a
That's a
good
losing
idea.
proposition.
Say what?
That's a losing battle.
That's a losing battle. Yeah. I mean, so whatever you do, don't get in the you don't get in the way of God's will. So just a couple interesting things there. So verse 25.
Then they sat down to eat a meal. But as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels, carrying ladbanum resin, balsam, and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, and let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him out and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. So they brought Joseph into Egypt.
So they throw Joseph in this pit. Verse 25. Then they sit down to eat. So Joseph's taking care. Might as well just chill out, have a little bit of a snack. Enjoy some time.
Lunchtime.
That's right. That's right. Um, and then all of a sudden, while they're eating, they see some Ishmaelites. They see a caravan of Ishmaelites, okay, with their camels, carrying all this stuff that they're ultimately going to take down to Egypt. So these are traders, right? These are people moving stuff to ultimately take down to Egypt, things of value. And the Ishmaelites were the descendants of guess who? Who do you think that is, Justin?
Abraham and Hagar. Psh.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about Ishmael, if you would, please.
Yes, so Abraham, so his second wife Hagar, who Sarah convinced him to take in order to have the promised child, they had a son named Ishmael, and then Sarah got mad and sent them off, and so but then God visited Hagar in the wilderness and told her that Ishmael would become a nation, but that he was a wild man, and that the nation would just fight with everybody and all that kind of stuff. And so, but that nation would be prosperous.
Absolutely. And so these are people from that nation, from the nation of the Ishmaelites. So the reason why I want to point this out very clearly is this is a lot of this is all interconnected, right? We just learned about Ishmael several chapters ago, and now they're running into some Ishmaelites here. So these are pretty much the cousins, right? This is pretty much their cousins that are rolling down the road here. And so and then they come up with a plan. Hey, specifically Judah comes up with a plan to sell Joseph into slavery as opposed to killing him. And so it's clear here that Judah didn't. It sounds like he wasn't a huge fan of killing him either. He thought this might be a better idea ultimately to get some money off of him. I'm not saying that Judah's particularly noble in this case, but it seems that maybe Judah wasn't super excited and didn't relish in killing Joseph. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have come up with this idea. And ultimately, if you're being sold into slavery, to these traders. It's really hard for you to become the ruler of your family if you never see your family again. So this also kind of solves that problem that they had with ultimately him having all these dreams.
So his brothers sold him for 20 shekels of silver, which is actually 8 ounces of silver by today's standards. This appears to be the average price for a slave in that time. It also appears that Joseph was sold into slavery around the end of the reign of Pharaoh Amenemes II. This will become more relevant in later chapters when Joseph's relationship with the ruling Pharaoh takes center stage of the story, but it is believed that Joseph was sold into slavery around 1897 BC.
Whoa, okay, that was a long time ago. Verse 29. Okay, now Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat, and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the multicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Then he examined it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." So Jacob tore his clothes and put on a sackcloth undergarment over his waist and mourned for his son many days. Then all his sons and all his daughters got up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard.
So we see his brother Reuben, Joseph's brother Reuben, was very upset over what happened to Joseph. And in this section, while Jacob once was the clever deceiver, now he is being deceived by his sons, just like he had deceived his father. And so Jacob, when he was younger, had deceived his father using goat skin, and now his sons were deceiving him using goat's blood. So once in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, who was Pharaoh's captain of the guard. And so the name Potiphar possibly meant the one whom the god Ra has given, or the one who is placed on earth by Ra. And so Ra was the Egyptian god of the sun, or the kings or the sky.
Yeah, as we see here, Reuben's big plan to ultimately put Joseph into a pit and then come back and get him out of the pit, thus saving his brother from being murdered. That whole plan is foiled because when Reuben comes back, his brothers ultimately sold Joseph into slavery. And so ultimately, Reuben, being the eldest of the brothers, likely would have been the one that was most responsible for his brother. And so the fact that his brother ultimately was devoured, it's not a good look. Reuben fails again. That's one big reason why you don't want to get two sins back to back. That's
Rubes.
that's a general rule. Don't go back to back on the sins, okay? I'm not saying he was sinning here. He tried his best ultimately, but you know, he failed his father, right? Again, and it doesn't specifically say that, but him being the oldest, like I said, could have come off that way. Um, we see deception again, as Justin mentioned. Man, that deception is just funneling down this family lineage. It's like deception all over the place. You don't need to deceive people ultimately to receive God's blessing. You can ultimately do that the good old fashioned way, which is patience. Hard work and patience and relying upon God for that. And so also we see Jacob. Jacob earlier in the chapter kept the matter in mind. We read in verse 11 of this chapter, right after we hear that Joseph is delivered this second dream to his father. His father's not happy about it. His father rebukes him. In verse 11, it says, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So I think his father thought there might be something to this. And it makes sense, right? Jacob had some pretty incredible dreams that ultimately had a huge influence on his life. So it makes sense that he would take his son's dreams very seriously, especially knowing all the promises that God had for this family. And so, but we see here the fact that his son, he believes his son is now past. Joseph clearly didn't believe in the dream that strong, because if he did, then he would maybe question a little bit more that maybe my son is in fact not dead. So didn't have that huge strong of a conviction ultimately in those dreams. Finally, Potiphar, he's a big deal. Notate that ultimately, because that ultimately is who Joseph is the slave of. And so Joseph's master is Potiphar. And that's going to pick up into the next chapter. Potiphar, according to some of the commentaries I read, would have been in charge of the king's executioners who carried out the capital sentences ordered by Pharaoh.
Yes, so my closing application would be that we see in life and in scripture that even if we behave righteously, suffering can occur. And so I'm sure that Joseph had to wonder, how can my experience of being sold as a slave fit with God's plan of me being a ruler like you revealed to me in these dreams? And so, one of the things I believe gave Joseph hope is that he believed God's plan for his life despite what he was experiencing in the moment. And as we see, testing and development of character in order to be used by God is where this story is headed. And it's also a biblical principle. There's a book in the New Testament that addresses this. It's in James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
Absolutely. My final thoughts on this is I think we see a lot of immaturity from Joseph. Um, we see a lot of sins kind of passing down from, generations that just seem to just keep coming up, which is, important with regards to immaturity, right? I mean, I think us being mature, sometimes it's not cool to be a mature 17-year-old, but really it's in terms of actually having extremely valuable use of your time at that age. It's irreplaceable, I mean, anybody who could be 17 in their high school sharing the gospel is going to be able to do that in a way in which Justin and I aren't going to be able to do exactly. We're not going to be able to do it the same way. If we could go back and change it up, unequivocally, we would both want to do that. No question about it. Like, I'll trade everything that I was doing in high school for an opportunity to go back and serve God more during that time. So, despite Joseph's immaturity, I think we can still strive to be wise and mature at that age. Sins of the father, I would just be very wary that let's not continue to pass down sins. So your sins have a huge impact on other people, a huge influence. You never know who's looking or watching. You never know who looks up to you. And so I would say just about everybody has somebody looking up to them. So what you do, people are watching and they're looking, and you can have an absolute huge influence on many, many people to come. And finally, I think this particular chapter hones in on jealousy. Let's lift our brothers up. You know what I mean? Let's lift our brothers up and be stoked about their successes. Let's not be jealous. Listen, there's enough to go around. God gave everyone blessings, different skill sets and blessings, and we should be stoked to see our brothers, be incredible at one thing or another. You know what I mean? That should lift us up and get us excited.
Don't be jelly.
That's right. That's right. Don't be jelly. Yeah, totally a lot to take away. Joseph's life, very cool. This is just the beginning, tip of the iceberg. Joseph sold into slavery. This is a bad day, right? Joseph can't be stoked about this, right? First off, his brothers want to kill him. They throw him into a pit. Now he's sold into slavery as someone who, I mean, he's property now. I mean, just a few minutes before that, he's the favorite son with the tunic, you know? Now he's pretty much as low as you can go, right? I don't know how much you go lower than being, than ultimately being a slave. And I mean lower, not as like slaves don't have less value than anybody else, but it's not the most great place to be in.
It's a lower social status.
That's right. So, anyways, everybody, thank you so much. Super stoked to get into chapter 38. Hope everyone has a brotastic bro day, and we'll bro you later.
See yas.